Hello. Picture this. A wealthy old man offers a young guy his entire fortune in exchange for agreeing to dine on his dead body. But what if the price of this deal is not just money, but something far more sinister? The film opens with the main character, Rick, preparing food for his mentally ill mother. Carrying a tray, he suddenly stops when he sees her standing in the middle of the room, reciting a prayer. Out of nowhere, the woman turns to her son and says, "Forgive me," before, without giving him a chance to react, taking her own life with a gunshot to the head. 3 years pass. Rick Malone hurries to a job his best friend Jeremy found for him. It was Jeremy who got Rick a spot on a work crew tasked with renovating the estate of a wealthy man named George Drayton. Rick arrives at the job, terribly late, and nearly gets fired. But Jeremy vouches for his friend to the boss, saving his place. During the job, Rick sustains an injury and asks the house staff, specifically the estate manager named Antoinette, for a first aid kit. She leads him inside the mansion, provides antiseptic and gauze bandages, and then leaves him. After bandaging himself, Rick prepares to leave the house but decides to borrow something from the owner first. In one of the rooms, he finds some cash, but he's caught red-handed. George Drayton forgives the young man and even allows him to keep the money. Later, Rick returns to Jeremy's rented apartment as he's struggling financially. His friend lets him stay there for free. The next day, while working, Rick is summoned by George Drayton. Sitting at a table savoring exquisite dishes, the old man strikes up a conversation with the young man, revealing that after his death, all this wealth will go to no one, as he has neither children nor grandchildren. He asks Rick about his religious beliefs, and the young man admits he was once devout, but has since drifted from faith. Suddenly, George offers Rick an unusual deal. He's willing to give him his entire fortune if Rick agrees to dine on his dead body. The proposal shocks Rick, and George clarifies that he's amassed many sins in his lifetime. After all, angels don't become this rich. Seeking to cleanse himself before passing into the next world, he offers the young man the chance to take on his sins through this ritual. Rick asks why he was chosen, to which the old man replies that he's never helped those in need and wants to make amends. Rick can't give a definitive answer, but George senses that the young man will likely accept his offer. Later, at a party at Jeremy's place, Rick runs into his ex-girlfriend Tanya, who's now dating his friend. They talk about the past, and she hints that their relationship began to crumble after his mother's death. At the same party, Jeremy gets into a conflict with one of the guests. Concerned about his friend's behavior, Rick tries to calm him down, but in a fit of emotion, Jeremy pushes Rick away and starts airing grievances, accusing him of ingratitude. Hurt by these words, Rick retreats to the bedroom, where, feeling overwhelmed, he dwells on dark thoughts. The next morning, he tries to find any kind of job, but all his efforts end in rejection. Suddenly, a driver in an expensive car arrives and hands Rick an invitation to George Drayton's funeral. The driver also gives him a black suit and says he'll be waiting in the car. Rick quickly changes and, leaving Jeremy bewildered, leaves the apartment. On the way, Rick asks the driver how George died, but the driver candidly admits he can't say. When Rick arrives at the estate, Antoinette greets him and offers him a contract to sign. The contract's contents shock Rick. He must eat every crumb of the dishes served on the deceased's body, or the contract will be void. When he asks Antoinette when Drayton died, she replies that it happened that morning. When Rick is led to the room with the body, he feels a surge of anxiety and fear and tells Antoinette he's not entirely ready for this. She informs him that the contract is in his name alone, and if he refuses, the estate will be destroyed. After some thought, Rick decides to fulfill the contract's terms and begins consuming dish after dish, eventually eating every last remnant. Antoinette hands him a card with an incantation he must recite to complete the ritual. He speaks the words, signs the document, and is suddenly overwhelmed by nausea, fleeing to the bathroom. Exhausted, Rick collapses into his new bed, but peaceful rest eludes him. He's plagued by a horrific nightmare. Waking up the next morning, he dresses and heads downstairs. There, a staff member locks eyes with him before hurriedly retreating to another room. Antoinette explains to Rick that the staff is forbidden from making direct eye contact with him and assures him it won't happen again. She then hands him an unlimited credit card and advises him to enjoy the new opportunities now open to him. Rick visits his friend and tells him he's moving out. As a gesture of gratitude, he offers Jeremy money, but his friend refuses it. Stepping outside, Rick spots Tanya, who's surprised to see his car and personal driver. He shares the news that things have turned around for him and suggests grabbing a drink. But Tanya, sensing something off about him, says she needs to get back to Jeremy. Afterward, Rick stops by a club to flaunt his ability to buy the most expensive whiskey to the other patrons. Back at his sprawling mansion, he continues drinking, but soon notices blood dripping from his nose. Moments later, a dead woman grabs him by the throat, her eerie voice declaring that he killed her. The next thing he sees is her ruthlessly drowning him in water. He comes to, sprawled on the floor in soaked clothes, and rushes to Antoinette to tell her about the horrifying vision. He begins to suspect that everything changed after the ritual and begs her to tell him what words he spoke, as his memory fails him. The manager offers him the card with the incantation, and at that moment, he realizes he essentially pawned his soul and took on all of Drayton's sins. Antoinette reveals that before his death, Drayton became obsessed with rituals, desperate to cleanse himself of sins, fearing he'd end up in hell. He knew that in England, until the late 19th century, there existed a profession called sin eater. These were usually poor people, hired by the families of the deceased, who consumed food placed on the bodies of the dead, thereby absorbing their sins, which they carried for the rest of their lives. Realizing what he's gotten himself into, the protagonist begins to panic. The feeling intensifies, and soon he jumps into one of his cars and heads to his priest. Entering the church, he begs the Holy Father to perform an absolution of sins, but he has no idea what specific sins he's taken on. The priest says he can help, but only if Rick is willing to confess his transgressions. Since Rick doesn't even know what Drayton's sins were, he returns to the estate and insistently asks Antoinette to share any information she has. She tells him that Drayton was a suspect in his wife's murder and offers to let him listen to interrogation recordings and review case files. From the information provided, Rick deduces that the old man likely strangled his wife, though he sincerely claimed it couldn't have been his wife, Susan. Rick then recounts the details of the murder he learned from the case files to his priest, who, horrified, begins to absolve him of the sins. During the process, the dead woman starts choking Rick, but vanishes the moment the absolution is complete. Overjoyed that disposable ghost is gone, Rick thanks the priest and rushes out of the church to continue enjoying his new life. The next day, his ex-girlfriend Tanya calls and asks him to visit Jeremy, who urgently needs help. Rick agrees to stop by, but doesn't specify when. That evening, while watching a movie, he's visited by a new ghost. When he manages to escape it, he suddenly encounters another. Both entities vanish the moment Antoinette touches him. Later, Rick discusses this with Antoinette, and she explains that Drayton was also a sin eater, absorbing numerous sins from the person who provided him with his initial wealth. Before Drayton, there were other sin eaters, and he took on their sins as well. Over time, he became a reclusive hermit, tormented by the horrors that constantly haunted him. Ultimately, he couldn't bear it and took his own life, knowing Rick would inherit his sins, sparing his soul from hell. Rick realizes he's burdened with a multitude of horrific acts committed by others, and he can't absolve each sin individually because he knows nothing about them. Antoinette explains that his only options are to accept this reality and enjoy the wealth while taking medications to cope with the visions and pain, or to die, passing all his sins to another sin eater to avoid eternal torment in hell. However, neither option appeals to Rick. That night, he decides to seek help from his priest again, but to his disappointment, the priest refuses him and doesn't even open the church doors, believing Rick to be a brutal murderer. Back at the estate, Rick makes a terrible decision. He washes down a handful of pills with strong liquor, hoping to dull the torturous visions. He teeters on the edge of death, but is saved. The doctor informs the revived Rick that his heart stopped for a couple of seconds. This experience sparks a new idea, and he shares with Antoinette the notion that he could pass his sins to someone else by dying temporarily, only to be brought back to life. Intrigued, she asks if he has someone in mind, and soon suggests Jeremy, believing that as a former soldier, he could handle the horrific burden. Still, Rick knows that even someone as tough as Jeremy wouldn't withstand it, and he doesn't want to condemn his friend to such a nightmare. Soon, Rick gets a call from Jeremy, who asks for money as he's in trouble with gangsters, and his life is in danger. Without hesitation, Rick agrees to help and, in a less than stable state, heads to Jeremy's place with cash. Upon arrival, the driver offers to accompany him, but Rick asks him to stay by the car. When he enters Jeremy's apartment, he's met with an eerie silence. In the ransacked apartment, he finds a gun and picks it up. Moments later, he encounters a ghost pleading for help in a desperate tone. Mentally unraveling, Rick shoots at it, only to realize that it's Tanya standing before him, sobbing. Rick comprehends what he's done. The driver bursts into the apartment and drags him to the car to flee the crime scene. Back at the estate, Antoinette assures Rick that they'll take care of everything, and no one will know what he did. However, if he doesn't want this to continue, he knows what he must do. Later, Rick invites Jeremy to the estate. His friend tells him that Tanya was killed by the gangsters he owed money to. Through Antoinette, Rick informs Jeremy that he's willing to give him his entire fortune if Jeremy agrees to eat a meal off his dead body. He realizes he can't handle this life, but believes his friend is strong enough to endure it. The proposal shocks Jeremy, but he ultimately agrees without much questioning. Before the ritual begins, the doctor warns Rick that his friend will have no more than 4 minutes to eat everything. Still, Rick believes Jeremy can manage it in time. Rick's heart is stopped, and he finds himself in a place where he sees the souls of the dead. He spots Tanya and begs for her forgiveness, but suddenly, spirits killed by other sin-eaters attack him. At that moment, his mother appears, saving him from the ghosts, and he returns to life. Antoinette informs him that everything went smoothly, and Jeremy managed to eat the entire meal, down to the last crumb, and recite the necessary words. She then asks Rick if he still sees ghosts, to which he indicates he does not. Time jumps forward 6 months. Jeremy still owns the estate and vast wealth, drowning the so-called side effects with alcohol and pills. But they help less and less. Meanwhile, Antoinette, in a crypt where the remains of the estate's former owners rest, writes a name in a ledger, Jeremy Miller. She then returns to the house and sits at the table, tasting the food laid out. At this moment, it becomes clear to us, the audience, that Antoinette is not human, but some ghostly or immortal being overseeing the transfer of these sins and the accompanying wealth. At the same time, we see Rick heading out for a lunch break. He now works at a construction site, and this life suits him just fine. He sits under a tree with the ghost of Tanya by his side, the only sin that remains with him.